Hello everybody. Our today's topic is the anatomy of the human brain. So you can see here a model of the human brain. So human brain is a very powerful structure on the earth, and the size of the human brain is like this. You can hold the brain on your palms, and the largest part of the brain is called the cerebrum. So when you see the brain, the largest part that you see first is the cerebrum. Okay, and cerebrum is a sphere. It consists of two hemispheres. So this whole thing is the cerebrum, and this is called the longitudinal fissure. Fissure is a deep groove, and this longitudinal fissure divides the cerebrum into two halves. So this half is the right hemisphere and this is the left hemisphere. So two hemispheres together form the cerebrum. Now I will show you the other parts of the brain that you can see from outside. Behind and below the cerebrum, you see this structure. This is called the cerebellum. So cerebellum is located behind and below, under the posterior part of the cerebrum. Okay, and then in front of the cerebellum, this part is called the brainstem. So cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. Those three large parts you can see from outside. Now we'll see each hemisphere. Each hemisphere has 4 lobes. This part, the entire front part, is called the frontal lobe, and behind the frontal lobe, this part is called the parietal lobe, and all the way back, this part is called the occipital lobe, and below the frontal and parietal lobe, this part is called the temporal lobe. So frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. Okay. Now you see on the surface of the cerebrum there are many grooves. These grooves are called sulci. Some people say sulci. So sulci or sulci, and each groove is called a sulcus. So there are many shallow grooves, and those are called sulci. And in between the grooves, the ridges are called gyri. So in between the grooves or sulci, you have many gyri. If I indicate only one, this is a gyrus. Singular is gyrus and plural is gyri. So this is a gyrus between two sulci. Okay. This is another gyrus between two sulci. Now this is an important sulcus. Why? Because this sulcus separates the frontal and parietal lobes, and this is called the central sulcus. Okay, so in front of the central sulcus you have the frontal lobe, and behind the central sulcus you have the parietal lobe. Okay, and this prominent gyrus, the red colored in front of the central sulcus, is called the precentral gyrus. Pre means before the central sulcus. That's why it is called the precentral gyrus, and this gyrus is also called primary motor cortex. That means your motor function is mainly controlled by this gyrus. That's why it is called primary motor. Okay, that means the movement of the body is controlled by or regulated by this area, primary motor cortex, which is precentral gyrus, and this is behind the central sulcus, the blue one, and that's why it is called the postcentral gyrus. And this gyrus is also very important because this gyrus is called the primary somatosensory cortex, and this area processes your somatosensations like pain, touch, temperature. Those signals are processed in this area. Okay, so two very important gyri are here. Okay, one in front of the central sulcus, that's the precentral gyrus, primary motor. One is behind the central sulcus, this is postcentral gyrus, is primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, and this groove separates the temporal lobe from the lobes above, and this is called the lateral sulcus. So lateral sulcus separates the temporal lobe from the lobes above. Okay, if you see the surface of the cerebrum, there are many functional areas located on the surface. This area is an important area which is located, you see, just on the bank of the lateral sulcus, the upper middle part of the temporal lobe. This is called the primary auditory cortex. That means from your ears the sound signal arrives here and processed here. That's why it is called the primary auditory cortex, located in the upper part of the temporal lobe near the bank of the lateral sulcus. Okay, and this area here is called the Broca's area. Broca's area is very important. Why? Because this area is responsible for the production of speech. So speech production area is the Broca's area. Okay, and above the Broca's area you have the frontal eye field, and above the frontal eye field, this area, you see, just in front of the primary motor cortex, this is the primary motor cortex. In front of the primary motor cortex, this is called the premotor area. Okay, pre means before. This is motor, so this is premotor. Okay, then frontal eye field and Broca's area. Lesion of the Broca's area due to stroke or any other cause aphasia. Aphasia is a clinical condition in which the person cannot produce speech. Okay, so since this area is responsible for the production of speech, lesion to this area will cause the inability to produce speech. Okay, now there is another speech area which is located around here. The upper part of the back of the temporal lobe and the part of the parietal lobe, like this. This area is called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is responsible for the understanding or recognizing the sound or speech. So sound recognition area is the Wernicke's area, and lesion in this area would cause the inability to understand the speech of another person. So you won't be able to recognize what the other persons or other people are saying. So this is Wernicke's area for speech recognition, and this is Broca's area for speech production. And all the way in the back of the occipital lobe, this area is called the primary visual cortex. Primary is the main visual cortex. That means it is responsible for the sight, vision. So from your eyeballs, retinas of your eye, the signal arrives here, the visual signal, and processed here. And around the primary, you have secondary visual cortices. There are many other visual areas around the primary in this area. Okay. So now, in general, the occipital lobe is mainly responsible for the processing of visual signal or vision, and a temporal lobe has multiple important functions. Audition, this is primary auditory cortex, right? Wernicke's area, speech recognition, as well as attention is processed in this area mainly. Parietal lobe is mainly responsible for somatosensations, okay? And the frontal lobe is mainly responsible for higher order brain functions. The frontal lobe is larger in the human brain than other creatures. What are the higher order brain functions? Emotion, judgment, problem solving, doing math, okay, and other intellectual functions. Those are mainly processed in the frontal lobe, okay, and those are the higher order brain functions. Then we'll see the cerebellum. So this is the cerebellum, and cerebellum has two hemispheres, and this middle portion is called the vermis of the cerebellum, okay? And cerebellum is mainly responsible for maintaining the balance and equilibrium of your body. There are other functions too, but that is the most important function of the cerebellum. And then this is the brainstem part, and brainstem consists of three structures. If you go from the bottom, this is called the medulla oblongata, and this round part is called the pons, and above the pons, this part is called the midbrain. So midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Okay, these three structures together is called the brainstem. Brainstem is very important because important functions of your body are controlled by the brainstem. For example, your cardiac function, your respiratory function. Your respiratory centers are located inside the brainstem. Your cardiac centers are located inside the brainstem. And from those centers, your heart function or cardiac function, respiratory function are controlled. So damage in this area or this structure may cause the death, immediate death of the person. The heart function can be stopped, or respiratory function could be stopped if any injury occurs in this part of the brain. Okay. Now, if you see below the frontal lobe or under the frontal lobe, this structure is called the olfactory bulb. So these two are olfactory bulbs, and this part is called the olfactory tract. So olfactory bulbs receive the smell signal or olfactory signal from the nose and process the smell sent to the upper brain structures through the olfactory tracts. So tracts take the signal from the bulb to the higher brain structures. Okay, and these two are the ends of the optic nerves. You know, you have two optic nerves come from two eyeballs and end here, so they have dissected, so you can just see the end part of the optic nerves, and two optic nerves join here in this part, and this is called the optic chiasma. Okay, so optic chiasma is here, and then again from the optic chiasma two optic tracts go towards the brain. Okay, so optic nerves, optic chiasma, and the optic tracts behind the chiasma. And behind the optic chiasma you see these two small round structures. These are called the mammillary bodies. Mammillary bodies are mainly responsible for memory, okay, processing the memory. Now if you see the brainstem, you can see many cranial nerves are attached to the brainstem part. In the human nervous system there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and most of them arise from the brainstem part. That's why you see many cranial nerves are attached to the brainstem part. Okay, now let's quickly review. So this is a human brain, and the largest part of the brain is the cerebrum. Cerebrum consists of two hemispheres, right and left, and they are separated by this fissure or deep groove. This is called the longitudinal fissure, and on the surface of the cerebrum you will see many convolutions, many sulci, those are grooves, and many gyri, those are ridges. Okay, the purpose is to increase the total surface area. So if you just make the surface of the cerebrum flat, it will be very large because of those sulci. It's like foldings. The surface of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex, and each hemisphere consists of 4 lobes. The entire frontal part is called the frontal lobe, and the main areas in the frontal lobe are, most posterior part of the frontal lobe has an important gyrus. This is called the precentral gyrus. This is the central sulcus. So this is precentral gyrus is located in the most posterior part of the frontal lobe. Okay, and this gyrus is called the primary motor cortex. And then this area is the premotor area. Pre means before. So before the motor is premotor. Frontal eye field. And then Broca's area. Broca's area is responsible for the production of speech. Okay, and as a whole, the frontal lobe is responsible for the higher order brain functions like intelligence, judgment, analysis, problem solving. Those functions are creativity. Those functions are processed in the frontal lobe. Then this is the parietal lobe, and this is the most front part of the parietal lobe, and this gyrus is also very important. This is called the postcentral gyrus because behind the central sulcus. And this gyrus is called the primary somatosensory cortex. Why? Because somatosensory signals like pain, touch, temperature, those signals are processed here. Okay? And as a whole, the parietal lobe is responsible for the processing of sensory functions. Okay? Then this is the temporal lobe. This is the lateral sulcus. Temporal lobe is responsible for the processing of sound, audition, and this is the primary auditory cortex in the upper part of the temporal lobe near the bank of the lateral sulcus. And in the upper back part of the temporal lobe and the part of the parietal lobe together form the Wernicke's area that is responsible for speech recognition. Okay? And this is the occipital lobe. The most posterior part is the primary visual cortex, and other visual areas are located here. Okay? So many visual areas are located in the occipital lobe. That's why occipital lobe is mainly responsible for the processing of visual signal. Okay? So that is the cerebrum. Now we'll see the cerebellum again. So posterior inferior, that means behind and below the cerebrum you have the cerebellum. It has two hemispheres too, and this is the vermis, the middle part of the cerebellum, and the cerebellum as a whole is responsible for maintaining the balance and equilibrium. Okay? This is the brainstem. It has three parts: medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain. Important functions of your body are controlled by the centers located inside the brainstem. For example, your cardiac centers are located in it, your respiratory centers, and some other reflex centers are located inside the brainstem. Okay? So the vital organs or functions are controlled by this part of the brain. And you also see many cranial nerves are attached to the brainstem. Then we'll see under the frontal lobe, so you have two olfactory bulbs. They receive the smell signal from the nose and first process the smell, and then through the olfactory tract they send the signal towards the brain structures. Okay? And these two are the end parts of the optic nerves, cranial nerve number 2, and optic nerves join here at the optic chiasma. Okay? And behind the optic chiasma you have the optic tracts, and also posterior to the optic chiasma you have these two small structures. These are the mammillary bodies responsible for memory. Okay? Processing the memory signal. Now we'll see inside. If you see the medial surface of the hemisphere, this structure is called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum consists of many fibers that go from one hemisphere to another. So through the corpus callosum the fibers go from one side of the brain to the other side, one hemisphere to the other hemisphere, and interhemispheric signal transmission or interaction is the main function of the corpus callosum. Areas between two hemispheres should talk to each other through the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is the only structure that holds the hemispheres together. Okay, and below the corpus callosum, this is called the lateral ventricle. Ventricle is a fluid-filled cavity inside the brain. So lateral ventricle is the largest ventricle. There are two. One is in this hemisphere, another is in the other hemisphere here. Okay, and the ventricles are filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. This structure looks like an arch. This is called the fornix. That means the arch. So this is the fornix. And fornix is also responsible for the processing of memory. And this structure is called the choroid plexus. Choroid plexus secretes the cerebrospinal fluid that is secreted inside the ventricles. So the cerebrospinal fluid inside the ventricles come from the choroid plexus. It secretes, continuously secreting the cerebrospinal fluid. This oval-shaped structure here is called the thalamus, a very important structure. Thalamus is called the major sensory relay station. Why? Because most of the sensory signals are processed here. Your pain, touch, temperature, your visual signal, your auditory signal, all are relayed or processed inside the thalamus. Okay, and this pink structure is the pineal gland. Pineal gland is responsible for the circadian rhythm. Sleep awakeness cycle is controlled by this gland. Okay, and also pineal gland produces melatonin. That is a chemical that is also related to sleep. So this is the thalamus again, and below the thalamus, this part is called the hypothalamus. Okay, and below the hypothalamus, actually here you have the pituitary gland. It's not shown here. Pituitary gland is located here. Okay, and hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland here by this structure. This is called the infundibulum. So this is the infundibulum. It connects the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Hypothalamus is an important structure. Hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, and you know that pituitary gland is the master gland. So master gland is controlled by the hypothalamus. So this is the boss of the pituitary gland. Okay. Hypothalamus also regulates the food and water intake. How much you will eat or drink, that is controlled by the hypothalamus. So you know, when you are hungry, you think that you will eat a lot, you start eating, then gradually you lose interest. Inhibition goes from the hypothalamus. Okay, okay. Then this part is the midbrain. This is the pons, this is the medulla, and these three structures form the brainstem. So this whole part is the brainstem, right? Midbrain, pons, this round part, and medulla oblongata. Behind the midbrain, you see here, you have two tiny round structures in each hemisphere. You have similar twist structures in the other hemisphere behind the midbrain, and the upper one is called the superior colliculus and lower one is called the inferior colliculus. And superior colliculi, there are two, right? And the upper two are responsible for visual processing, and lower two are inferior colliculi, responsible for auditory processing. And those four together is called corpora quadrigemina. quadri means 4. So 2 superior colliculi and 2 inferior colliculi in the back of the midbrain together is called the corpora quadrigemina. If you see the lateral ventricle, the largest ventricle in your brain, there are 2, and there is another ventricle here that is called the third ventricle, and this one, you see the cavity, this is called the fourth ventricle. All these ventricles are filled with the cerebrospinal fluid or CSF, and they are connected to each other, so fluid can go from one ventricle to another. So from the lateral ventricle, the fluid can go to the third ventricle here through this opening, and this is called interventricular foramen. Makes sense, in between the ventricles, interventricular foramen. And from the third ventricle, the fluid can go to the fourth ventricle here through this passage, and this is called the cerebral aqueduct. This long, channel is called the cerebral aqueduct. So fluid can go from the third to the fourth via the cerebral aqueduct. Now we'll see inside the cerebellum. Inside the cerebellum, you will see tree-like white structures, and these are called arbor vitae. Arbor vitae is a term that means tree of life. Okay, so let's quickly go over the medial aspect of the hemisphere. This is the corpus callosum. Through the corpus callosum, many fibers go from one side to other side, one hemisphere to the other hemisphere. So interhemispheric signal transmission or interaction is the main function. This is the structure attaches two hemispheres together. Okay, this is the lateral ventricle. There is another one on the other side, and lateral ventricle contains the cerebrospinal fluid, and it is connected to the third ventricle via the interventricular foramen, and third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, and this is the fornix, which is mainly responsible for the processing of memory. Okay, arch-like structure, fornix. This is the choroid plexus. It secretes the cerebrospinal fluid into the ventricles. This is the pineal gland, responsible for the circadian rhythm and production of melatonin. This is the thalamus, major sensory relay station, and below the thalamus, this is hypothalamus, responsible for food and water intake, right? It controls the pituitary gland, and then you have pituitary gland here, not shown, and hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland by the infundibulum. Now we'll see the brainstem. This part is the brainstem. This is the midbrain, the upper part. Then this is the pons, and this is medulla oblongata. In front of the midbrain, you see here, this is a mammillary body. There are two. Mammillary bodies are also responsible for memory. In the back of the midbrain, you have superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. Superior colliculi are for the processing of visual signal, sight, and inferior colliculi are for the sound, auditory function. And all four together is called corpora quadrigemina. Okay, this is inside the cerebellum, and tree-like structures are called arbor vitae. And cerebellum is responsible mainly for the balance and equilibrium. Okay, now we'll see some of those structures in this half head model. So you already know these structures. This is the corpus callosum, this is the lateral ventricle, okay, this is the fornix, choroid plexus, pineal gland, okay, thalamus, hypothalamus, below the thalamus is hypothalamus, and here you can see the pituitary gland. So this is the pituitary gland, okay, and you already know that the pituitary gland sits in the hypophyseal fossa of the sphenoid bone. So this is the sphenoid bone, and this is the sink-like or basin-like structure of the sphenoid bone, that is called the hypophyseal fossa for the pituitary gland, okay. And this is infundibulum. It connects the hypothalamus and pituitary, okay, and hypothalamus controls the pituitary. This is a mammillary body. Now we'll see the brainstem. This is the midbrain part, this is the pons, the round part, and this is the medulla oblongata, okay. So these three structures together is the brainstem. Now you see, this is the cerebral aqueduct that connects the third ventricle and fourth ventricle. This is the fourth ventricle, and these tree-like structures are called arbor vitae inside the cerebellum, okay. So those are the structures you can see in this half-head model. So this is the medial side of the hemisphere, okay.